Hi, in this lecture we're going to consider the aspects of becoming modern. I feel this is relevant to us as people who are interested in clothes or fashion and costume, since it's important to understand what the concept of modern may have meant in different times. In the process, we're going to look at what's seen as pre-modern, modern, postmodern identities, and in particular theories relating to how these identities have moved from a fixed to a fluid state. The overall aims of the lecture are to help to present theories on identity and change and its representation in dress. So, as I say, this idea of the relationship between clothes and change. It's also about identifying quotes that will hopefully help you to contextualise your ideas and provide reference for your own sort of critical thinking and for the essays that we have set for the lecture programme. In the process, I'm going to be highlighting key practitioners and thinkers, and these I would suggest you go and do sort of further research on, as I will be signposting you to relevant literature. The key topics that I'm going to be covering are the aspects of what it means to be modern and how different art and design movements have represented this. It's also going to be about a historical look at pre-modern, modern and postmodern theories of identity, and as I say, looking at when these occurred and what relevance they may have to us as fashion and costume designers. It's also about how change in clothes occurs and how this change has potential to carry meaning for those adopting new styles and ways of being. I think importantly, I suppose it's for me the interesting part about sort of change within clothes is this relationship between different states. So the image on the left showing a drawing from the Goody's Ladybook from 1850s, and then the image of Vivienne Westwood in the middle, in a very sort of different state of attire. And the argument, I suppose, is to what extent is this a change in identity? It's also interesting to see how then Vivienne Westwood maybe takes inspiration from a historical context, as we see here in the her Watteau dress of, on the right-hand side. So I feel that history is important for us as people who are interested in clothes, as it can provide inspiration and add authenticity to in a costume or fashion design. It's about uncovering the innovators of change of particular times as well to help us to become innovative. So as I say, I think this notion of authenticity is all important, particularly when we are designing for a particular era or sort of time or state of being. And as I say, again, relating back to the innovators of the time, so someone like Chanel becomes important if we are to capture the essence of her representation of a modern woman in the 1930s. The other aspect, of course, to this is the idea of contextualizing our ideas, and I feel to bring in further context relating to identity can help us to view our material representations, so our designs, within both historical and contemporary contexts, and seeing the link between the two. It's also about how we can maybe as well begin to shift interpretations of history, particularly relating to notions of femininity. Um, so the interesting study by Ken Russell into the lost 1950s sort of teddy girls. It's a very interesting study into how women were representing themselves at that time. But identity is also about promotion and marketing of our ideas. We need to know about identity in order to get a sense for our consumers, for our market audience. And to this end as well, it's also interesting to look at the relationship between the identity of the fashion designer and their creations and their models. So where they may have sort of muses. So the image here on the right hand side of Dior in 1957 of the designer, and then his representation of womanhood on the model to the left. and again how this is maybe represented in sort of through the fashion press. Another key interesting sort of discussion into this is the extent to which artists and practitioners use the body as a surface to play around with ideas of identity. So Lee Bowery, how he transforms and manipulates his body through cloth. And similarly, the photographer Cindy Sherman representing different sides of characters that she perceives being acted out in real life. So I think key to this idea of modern identity is an understanding of sort of some of the terminology. So as I've already mentioned, the word modern, and this it received usage in England in the 16th century, and by the 19th century we see the term contemporary to be meaning a similar thing. I love the word zeitgeist as well. This generally means spirit of the times, and again this is about relating a particular movement, a particular style to a period in time. Elsa Schiaparelli, when she designed her lobster print dress, was drawing direct references to Dali and the relationship between sort of surrealism and the exploration of different forms of art and design. But there are sort of aspects of interpretation that can cause us a few dilemmas. We need to have, get a perspective on the prevailing values and practices of the day in order to give our work sort of value and meaning. We can also look at sort of terminology within art and design discourse. So modernism in art can refer back to John Ruskin, who is writing his book Modern Painters in the 1800s. He was really using the term to refer to painters of the day, such as the Pre-Raphaelites, who today we wouldn't necessarily consider to be modern artists. So the painting here by William Hunt, we can ask the question of, well, why is this modern? And for that, we need to get context, comparing it with what would have come before this, and recognising how actually it was representing a very relaxed, informal pose compared to the very formal poses from before. There was a heightened sense of possibly sort of religious abandonment, as we see the shepherd abandoning his flock, and sort of sexuality. It's also set in a rural setting, so setting the ideal for this rural romantic life. Modernism in design, however, takes on a slightly different slant. The Bauhaus movement of 1930s is seen as one of those sort of key movements where we see designers responding to aspects of urbanisation. Designers as well no longer seeking inspiration from the past and taking quite anti-historic positioning. It was also about form following function and truth to materials. This was partly a backlash to some of the pieces that had been developed in the Great Exhibition, and how we were seeing materials like papier-mâché being disguised, to look like wood. And as I said, the element of functionality. Key to this as well were designers and artists responding to technology that was available at the time, and innovations taking place within sort of production and materials. And again, I suppose that's important for us designers to look back and to see key changes in technology and how this would have had an impact on what was ultimately designed and how it was produced. There was also a move within modernism in design to look at internationalism. So in many cases this meant a stripping back of decorative materials that maybe had a sort of a tradition or indigenous slant to them. So streamlining became very important. So maybe we could argue within this context that something like McDonald's, which has a very international brand, takes on some of this this sort of modern approach. I think in relation to clothing, the argument to move towards urban design is relevant. The spectacle of the city will have brought people into new spaces and new interactions. It will have been about their response to progress and change, and particularly industrialization. We see with clothing the move towards more industrial processes of manufacture, and this has an impact on the styles that were ultimately designed. So let us take this back down then to identity, and particularly the argument that we live in more of a postmodern world, and within this context identity takes on different meaning. Identity can be linked to our ideas about personality. The traditional approach, which we see as the essentialist approach, is that biology is what makes us who we are, and that we all have this inner essence. Postmodernists generally disagree with essentialists, and it's part of our argument now to look at this discussion. If we take identity, we can see three key historical phases. Obviously, there is movement and debate within these areas, but essentially, pre-modern identity is pre-1800s. Modern identity is seen to lie between 1800s and 1950s, and our postmodern identity comes from the 1960s onwards, when we see again, vast sort of social change. A pre-modern identity is really where the identity is fixed by social roles, and these are defined by birth. I mean, some would argue that these still exist, so things like the monarchy having defined roles attached to us. If we're interested in clothing, a great place to start for looking at this pre-modern identity is to go back to original art paintings of the time. So this pre-modern identity, it's argued, is stable, it's fixed, it's defined by long-standing roles, and it's something essentially that you're born into. It's also argued that it's determined by certain institutions, so things like marriage, so that transition from being a girl to being a married woman is important. The church, monarchy, the state, and as I've said, our occupation. When we look at a modern identity, it's argued that this really is a response to the city, so this urbanisation. Here we see an image of Paris, which was radically transformed in the 1800s to create boulevards in the city where people could promenade. In this context, it's argued that the fashion and clothing styles have trickled down through a process of emulation. It's seen that the upper classes will have the taste and the status within society, and in many ways sort of determine the style that is seen out and about. As this trickles down to the lower classes through a process of emulation, the upper classes want to become distinct, so adopt new styles, and thus we see this cycle of fashion. Two key theorists who analysed the role of clothes within this context are Simmel and Veblen, and started that sort of whole debate about how fashions and clothing styles are adopted through society. Again, paintings of the time can provide us with great insight into how people maybe were sitting at balconies to be seen and to display the elements of status and taste and class. Promenading in this way, sort of showing off their leisure time, and again, something like leisure becomes very important, a very sort of signifier of our status and our class, and also the habits that may be prevalent at the time. As we move from this modern identity, though, into what is signified as a postmodern identity, here we see that identity is very much formed by these social experiences. Erving Goffman, in his seminal text, The Presentation of the Self in Everyday Life in 1959, highlights how identity should be seen as a series of facades. It's something we can put on and take off. In this context, life becomes theatre. We can put on different costumes, different outers, and in this way, identity, it's argued, becomes fluid. It's no longer fixed, and we can change aspects of identity as we please. Someone like the artist Orland takes these to extremes, where she uses sort of costumes and masks and quite sort of radical plastic surgery to change, the outer. I suppose the debate arises as to the extent to which you are changing your identity, or whether it's just a superficial appearance that you are changing. I also like this quote by Eco, where he talks about, it is not theatre that is able to imitate life. It is social life that is designed as a continuous performance, and because of this, there is a link between theatre and life. And again, I like this in terms of the relationship between our social experiences and the extent to which we're putting on a performance. Someone like Madonna, 1980s and the MTV generation, where image was all important, uses her body as a canvas for different identities. Within this context, it's argued that we see quite a lot of irony and rhetoric and storytelling. It's also about the appropriation of different sort of signs and symbols and twisting them. So the crucifix, and her role playing as Marie Antoinette at the bottom there. Another key seminal postmodern text is Virginia Woolf's Orlando, both in the book and also the later film with Tilda Swinton in it. This is a fascinating investigation into the power of clothing to change people's perceptions of us, and also their relationship with us. I also mention this as there's a great text by Bruzzi in her book The Undressing Cinema, which goes into more detail about these two texts. So we can see, really, in terms of sort of an aesthetic movement, the modern movement was really exemplified by a simplified aesthetic, about utopian ideals, and about truth to materials. As we're going into more sort of postmodern aesthetics, these, it's argued, are defined by their complexity, by their chaos, by the way that materials and styles are mixed and matched. It's also known as bricolage, where we bring elements from different contexts and put them all together to show some aspect of parody and irony. The positives of this postmodern identity is that difference is actually celebrated. With a fluid identity which isn't fixed for life, we can shop around for identities. I suppose as a positive, it's also quite a negative in that there is sort of focus on a consumer society. David Bowie, again, someone who uses this postmodern context to play around with ideas of gender and different characters that he brings out. And our modern day Lady Gaga, how she uses her body and clothing to represent different aspects of herself. Elizabeth Wilson, a key fashion writer, argues that in this context, the body, together with the clothes that we dress it in, become meaningful products and representations. I think what to take from that is the concept of clothing having meaning, and also an interesting investigation into what it may represent. A further look at modern identity versus postmodern identity can see how modernism was essentially an expression of modern life then, of technology, of new materials, and of communication, this concept, modernity. Whereas postmodernism becomes about a reaction to it. It's no longer an expression, it's reacting to some aspect of modern life, be it positive or negative. In this context, politics become important, and particularly the idea of identity politics. These, it's argued, can be based around various categories. So, for example, race, ethnicity, sex, gender, religion, disability, and culture. And suppose dependent upon what is seen as the prominent or the most dominant within these areas. Another quote that sort of contextualised this is by Goodrum in the chapter Land of Hip and Glory in the book Dressed to Impress, Looking the Part, where it's argued that the body becomes a surface to be inscribed upon, transformed and manipulated by various hegemonic and institutional regimes. I think the idea of hegemony or hegemonic dress within this context is really about, you know, dominant sort of forces of power that may have an impact upon what we are able to wear, and what we feel comfortable wearing. If we've ever worn a school uniform, this is where our body's been transformed by an institutional regime such as education. But obviously there are more sort of subtle regimes as well that may be in place. So, as I say, you know, then we need to look at the negatives of this postmodern identity in that, you know, it can become unstable. It can be argued that identity in this context has become very superficial. And if we agree with Goffman that our identity is a facade, that it can become potentially illusionary. It also argues that it can become very accelerated and extended and possibly never ending. Some authors would argue that this is related to our relationship with consumerism. So Judith William, in her book Decoding Advertisements, which is a great study of advertisements, and in particular sort of stereotyping within that context, she says instead of being identified by what they produce, people identify themselves through what they consume. And again, this is important within the debate between modern and postmodern identities, maybe in that, you know, no longer attached to what we actually produce or make. We consume our identity. I suppose it's, you know, interesting to look at where this consumption of this identity may also come from and how this is backed up through, you know, the media. I find it also fascinating to look at digital identities because I feel this is this example of this extended identity. So where we may be able to communicate with each other privately and locally, but it's also sort of a global extended identity. It's all about the importance of the image and of the photo within this context and our connection to technology. Zygmunt Bauman takes this one step further to argue that we no longer live in a postmodern world, but we live in a liquid world. And in his book Liquid Modernity and his discussion of liquid life, it's very interesting to analyse the extent to where identity fits. He argues that society is being transformed by the passage from a solid to a liquid phase of modernity, in which all social forms melt faster than new ones can be cast. They are not given enough time to solidify and cannot serve as the frame of reference for human actions. And long-term life strategies, because their alleged short life expectation undermines efforts to develop a strategy that would require the consistent fulfilment of a life project. I think what it's saying is that, yes, modernity as we see it now is a liquid phase, but that there's so much going on that it doesn't actually have time to solidify. We've seen the fashion cycle drastically increase from maybe, you know, designers designing maybe one or two collections a year to almost, you know, sort of a weekly or monthly change and revamp of styles and fashions. Not sure why, but it brings, you know, someone like Katie Price and Michael Jackson, this element of sort of, you know, short-term sort of projects, this to exemplify this. And Bauman also takes this into a, it's about consumption. And I love this quote where he says, "You must lose the ponchos which were so en vogue last year, since if you wear a poncho now, you look like a camel. Donning pinstripe jackets and t-shirts is over, simply because no one wears them. And so it goes on. If you don't wish to sink, keep surfing. And that means changing your wardrobe, your furnishings, your wallpaper, your look, your habits, in short, yourself, quickly and as often as you can." like I say, I think this is relating this partly to a capitalist sort of context, which is reliant on, you know, the obsolescence of products, so that people do keep buying and do keep changing, and that's all part of that sort of, you know, consumer society. Jean Baudrillard goes further as well to talk about how we have a simulated identity. He argues that reality no longer exists, and instead it's been superseded by hyperreality and simulation. If we go back to the image of the IKEA, you know, this sense of a simulated reality occurs when we go into a shop. I'll never forget seeing a family sitting down in a living room in a shop in IKEA and trying to cut plastic bread and having a conversation and acting out their daily life, but in a very sort of simulated way, possibly imagining themselves in there. Again, you know, this simulation, you know, is cosplay part of a simulated life, where we take, you know, different characters and simulation through images given to us through the computer and through the internet, and particularly in sort of advances in graphic and 3D rendering design. So as we close on some of this debate, I suppose the questions maybe to ask ourselves is, you know, should we be constantly searching for the new and responding to change? You know, what is it about, you know, clothes and fashion that, you know, represent this change, and why we you know, we desire this change? Or, you know, the extent to maybe we should be looking for more fixed and solid states of being. I mean, it could also be argued that, you know, to what extent do you believe that this has really occurred, and you know, the impacts of this change on identity. And I think to conclude, then, it's always good to finish with, you know, looking at our relationship to, you know, sort of key fashion texts. Again, Elizabeth Wilson argues that dress be seen as a mechanism through which the body is connected to the social world. Clothing in this context is seen as a cultural phenomenon, as an aesthetic mechanism for the expression of ideas, desires, beliefs circulating in society. And I think this is a nice thing to, you know, to ponder the extent to which we can read clothing and pull out how it does express our ideas and our desires and certain beliefs that we see operating around us. I think as well, by analysing clothes, we should be able to comment upon the society within which they were produced, and change within this context appears to be reflected in the forms in which we present ourselves. So, you know, just concluding on that, the notion that as people who are interested in fashion and in clothing and in costume, need to be aware of the society within which, you know, certain styles and representations of identity were produced. I think areas possibly for investigation is, you know, what makes us who we are, you know, how is our identity maybe represented and disguised, you know, thinking about what the key signs of our identity are today and have been in the past, you know, and how this may have changed. And also weighing up some of these positive and negative aspects of postmodern identity as well. To direct some of your reading, texts like Riley's The Meaning of Dress is interesting in the way it sort of sets out different discussions of dress, particularly from like a global perspective. The Roach Higgins book, Dress and Identity, again, is a real link between our relationship between, you know, clothes and the body. As I've mentioned, Stella Bruzzi, Undressing Cinema, Clothing and Identity in the Movies. From a more sociological approach, I'd look at Anthony Giddens in his Modernity and Self-Identity. And finally, the theory.org.uk website, and in particular David Gauntlet, who looks at media, gender and identity. Okay, thank you.